Hi, welcome to the Fools and Sages podcast. We are honored and excited and grateful today to have Steven Nadler with us. Steven is the Vilas professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He teaches philosophy, and he's also the author or editor of 19 books in the area of philosophy, especially focused on 17th century philosophers, the Cartesian revolution and Descartes himself, Spinoza, and also medieval Jewish philosophy, which I'm really interested to touch on today. Stephen, welcome. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Thanks for having me. Yeah, I'm a New Yorker by birth and have been living in Madison, Wisconsin since 1988. Was an undergraduate at Washington University in St. Louis, and then went back to New York to Columbia for my PhD in '86. And I've been at the University of Wisconsin since 1988. Teaching in the philosophy department. I'm presently, as you mentioned, Vilas Research Professor of Philosophy and also Director of the Institute for Research in the Humanities here at Wisconsin.
Great, thank you. So I know Brian has been reading up on Spinoza and Descartes and is especially excited to have you. So I'll kick it off to him to get the conversation started.
All right.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Nadler, for coming on and talking with us. I've been really excited. Um, I I'm probably over complimenting myself to say that I feel like we are brothers in arms, and that's because I think going back to the 17th century, there was this famous argument that I think was just intended to send barbs at Thomas Aquinas. But the argument was about how many angels could dance on the head of a pin. And I guess I feel like today a lot of people look at philosophers as if they are only focused on these obscure, kind of non relevant, pointlessly argumentative trivialities. And I couldn't disagree with that position more. I think it's super relevant. And from reviewing your work, I suspect that you, I think it's more than a suspicion, you must feel the same way. Um, and so, in looking at your work, I think that it's really important in ways that the average person might not grasp. And so that's what I kind of wanted to go into today. Um, you're known as as one of the leading experts in the work of Spinoza, and Spinoza is, I consider him one of the goats, one of the greatest of all times. He's unrecognized, I think, for the status that he deserves. And Spinoza was part of this transformation in human intelligence, trying to figure out the universe at a real important crossroads. Could you give us a little insight into the world before Spinoza? We tend to look at philosophers through our own lights, through our own use of language. And I think often it's such a stretch that we miss a lot there. Could you give us a little background of the world that Spinoza was immersed in and reacting to?
Sure. Although first, let me say I agree with you completely that philosophy is not an irrelevant, purely abstract exercise. Although there is an answer to the question of how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. It depends upon whether they are material or immaterial. If they're material, then only one can dance on the head of a pin. If they're immaterial, then infinitely many can. But the philosophers I find myself most interested in teaching and studying are those philosophers who are not concerned with strictly abstract metaphysical questions, but regard philosophy as a way of life, and especially as a means of discovering and living the best kind of life for a human being. So philosophers like Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Maimonides, Spinoza, these are philosophers who are not simply interested in epistemological or metaphysical questions for their own sake, but rather as a way of increasing our understanding of ourselves and of the world around us. The world that Spinoza grew up in was very different from the world in which many of the other philosophers we study grew up in, for a number of reasons. First of all, he was raised in a community in Amsterdam that was established in the Dutch Republic by Jewish refugees from Spain and Portugal. These were people who had been forced in the 15th and 16th centuries, forced to convert to Catholicism, but were always suspect of being insincere in their conversion and of continuing to practice Judaism in secret. And finally, the Inquisition became so harsh that a number of these families fled both Spain and Portugal, heading to different ports around the Mediterranean. But a number ended up eventually in Amsterdam, where they were able to return openly to the practice of Judaism. And so by the time Spinoza is born in 1632, you have a vibrant, well-off community of Sephardic, that is Spanish and Portuguese Jews, who are not forced into a ghetto and who are educating their children in the norms of Judaism. The broader world that Spinoza faced was, I think, in many ways transformed from the world you would have found 100 years earlier, with the discoveries by Galileo, this new conception of the nature of the cosmos. The heliocentric system is being defended by figures not just Galileo, but in a sense Descartes, with a bit of a wink on his part. Descartes was not quite ready, being a good French Catholic, to publicly proclaim that the sun is the center of the solar system. But it's also a world in which there's only one kind of matter, as opposed to the varieties of matter that you find in the old Aristotelian system. So medieval Aristotelian philosophers believed that the matter of the heavens was very different from the matter of our terrestrial realm, whereas early modern philosophers like Galileo and Descartes and Hobbes and Boyle regarded all of matter to be the same, whether you're talking about the matter in the sky or the matter on Earth. And matter and motion are the only allowable explanations for a good deal of natural phenomena. So if you're thinking simply of bodies that are not united with souls, the way in which Descartes says the human being is a soul-body combination, but if we think of simply unsouled bodies, all natural phenomena are the result of particles of matter in motion operating according to certain laws. This is a very different physical world from the world of medieval scholasticism. And Spinoza himself, though I don't think he made any major contributions to what we'd like to call the scientific revolution, it might be better called scientific revolutions, because it wasn't just a single mechanistic picture of nature. There was a variety of ways of understanding nature as a grand mechanism. But Spinoza, though not really a scientist himself, although he made some contributions to the study of optics and the production of lenses, he was completely on board with this new paradigm of looking at the cosmos and especially the world around us.
And he was in this world, I think, that some of us have a hard time grasping, that you couldn't just think what you wanted. Or if you did think what you wanted, you best keep it to yourself. And, it's almost a testimony. I think of Spinoza in that list of philosophers like Socrates, who felt that truth was important enough to drink hemlock, or Giordano Bruno, who was burnt at the stake for his heresy, or these people that really laid it on the line. And that's one of the things I love about Spinoza, is he didn't just think fancy things. he really was where the rubber meets the road kind of a guy, wasn't he? Like he lived his deal, and it wasn't just thinking.
Yes, I always loved the very last lines of his theological political treatise, which the work caused enormous scandal and is perhaps the most vilified book in the 17th century. And critics were calling it an atheistic book, a soul-destroying book, and one critic calls it a book forged in hell by the devil himself. But the very last lines of the book are, everybody should be free to think what they want and to say what they think. So if there is one theme that unites all of Spinoza's writings, from the ethics, his metaphysical, ethical work, to the theological, political treatise, that theme is freedom. The ethics is about how to achieve a kind of freedom as an individual, especially in a causally deterministic world. How can we achieve some degree of autonomy, virtue, rationality, and freedom? The theological political treatise is about freedom in a more political, social, and religious domain. What role is the state supposed to play in our private lives? Now, I think it's a little misleading to regard the 17th century as under a single regime of intolerance. It depended upon both where you were living and what you were talking about. And Spinoza had the good fortune of growing up and publishing his works in what is arguably the most tolerant milieu in the 17th century, that is, the Dutch Republic. But even within the Dutch Republic, there wasn't absolute freedom. First of all, it depended upon which province you were living in and which city in that province. Amsterdam, in the province of Holland, was probably the most liberal, cosmopolitan, and tolerant city in Europe at the time. And you could publish things in Amsterdam that couldn't possibly be published, say, in Paris or other cities. So he did have that benefit of growing up there.
And he was in this age post Martin Luther, post Bruno, where it seems like the bulwarks of institutional authority were shaking at their very roots. So he really was at this crossroads in the ways of thinking. I think it's I was impressed when I saw the degree that they went to try to cancel Spinoza. I mean, a heavy metal band would love to get the kind of reviews that Spinoza got.
Yes.
Forged in hell. We want you cursed when you're facing the east, cursed when you're facing the west, sitting down, standing up. That, social distancing applied to him. Can you fill us in about the grief that he bore for his thoughts at the age of 23, which itself blows my mind.
Yeah, so at a relatively young age, when he was still a businessman, a merchant within the Amsterdam Portuguese Jewish community, it was an importing business. He received from that community what is called a cherem, that is an ostracism or ban. Essentially, he was kicked out of the community. But this was something that happened rather frequently, or I should say not infrequently, in the Amsterdam Jewish community. The difference is that most of the cherems that were issued by the directors of this community were for relatively minor offenses. You could be put under the ban for sexual indiscretions, for engaging in theological discussion with Gentiles, even for taking a book out of the library without permission, for insulting a rabbi. And typical bans would last a couple of days, maybe a couple of weeks, but there was always a means of reconciling yourself to the community by apologizing for your offense and paying a fine. The text of Spinoza's cherem is so much longer and so vitriolic compared to the other cherems. It's full of curses and damnations, and it's clear that Spinoza, in the eyes of this community, is out for good. There's not a temporary ostracism. He is expelled from the people of Israel, according to this document. The mystery, though, is that the document, while it refers to his abominable heresies and horrible deeds, does not tell us what exactly those were. And so one very fascinating game that Spinoza scholars like to play is, well, what was the reason for the ban? So one scholar suggests that, in fact, the reasons were financial irregularities. It's true that Spinoza did use the mechanism of Dutch law to relieve himself of debts that he had inherited through his father's business. And that was both a violation of the Jewish community's regulations, where such disputes are supposed to be handled within the community. But he went outside the community to Dutch law, had himself declared an orphan, which he could do legally because he wasn't 25 yet, and therefore be relieved of the debts and become a privileged creditor on his father's estate. The other problem with that is that the Jewish community felt it undermined, by using the law to evade your debts in this way, it undermined the trustworthiness of Jewish merchants in the city. And these Jewish merchants were very well connected with Dutch merchants. They relied on commercial relationships. And so this scholar argues that the reason for the ban was Spinoza's using this means to relieve himself from heavy debt burdens. I think it's a fascinating theory. I'm not convinced, mainly because, first of all, the Cherem document talks about his heresies. And when you mention heresies, you're talking about ideas. You're not talking about financial actions. Moreover, the length of this Cherem, the curses directed at Spinoza, tell us there's something much deeper going on here. And in fact, we have reason for thinking that there were three philosophical themes that Spinoza was talking about around the time of the Cherem that plausibly explain it. Now, first of all, Spinoza, this was in 1656. Spinoza, as far as we know, had not written anything yet. He certainly had not published anything yet. He was not the philosopher, Spinoza. He was just this merchant. However, in 1658, some visitors from Spain were traveling through Amsterdam, and they happened to engage in a discussion with Spinoza. They must have met up with him in some way. And when these visitors went back to Spain, they were interviewed by the Inquisition, because the Inquisition was always interested in what was happening with these former conversos living elsewhere. People who still had relatives in Spain and Portugal. And so if you have a family of former conversos in Amsterdam openly practicing Judaism, and they have relatives in Spain or Portugal, they're more likely to be themselves practicing Judaism in secret. So these guys were interviewed by the Inquisition. Who did you meet in Amsterdam? What's going on in the Jewish community there? And they say, we met a man named Spinoza. And these are independent interviews. And this man, Spinoza, tells us that he was kicked out of the Portuguese Jewish community of Amsterdam for, first of all, saying that God exists, but only philosophically. Secondly, for saying that the law is not true. That is, the commandments of the Torah are no longer valid. And thirdly, for saying that the soul dies with the body, or denying personal immortality. And in fact, those are three themes that we see in Spinoza's more mature writings. So on the one hand, yeah, there's a great mystery here, because the Cherem document, does not specify what his offenses were. But for anybody who's actually read Spinoza's works, and the fact that we have evidence for thinking that the things we find in his later philosophical works, which he began just a few years after the Cherem, were things he might have been saying around the time of the Cherem, there's really not much mystery here, I think.
He poked the tiger.
He certainly did, yes.
Yeah.
And the kinds of things he was saying, no 17th century rabbi could possibly tolerate. I mean, I think I am not in favor of banning people for their ideas. Let me get that out there on the table. I am against cherems. I do not think that people should be excommunicated, banned, ostracized, or punished for ideas. That said, I don't see that the community had really any alternative to banning Spinoza.
Right. And the facing all of that push, I mean, they basically tried to cancel him. And facing all that from the outside, especially in your 20s, is shows a formidable type of self-assurance,
Yeah.
but it's not the thing that most impresses me about Spinoza. The thing that most impresses me about Spinoza is that when we talk about the idea of freedom, he doesn't just mean freedom from external influences, but he also means a kind of an internal freedom that we have won through the application, I guess he would say, of reason to our own selves, almost sensing the idea of the phenomenologist, saying that we have to look at ourselves and not just the outside world. And he really seems to be a product of that process. He's someone they tried to bait him out of that with cash. They tried to attack him physically. I mean, everything
So those are
he
actually
did.
myths that we have. We
Oh,
don't,
are they?
yeah, there's no evidence that they tried to pay him off. And the tale about the alleged assassination attempt that's only in one source, and I'm a little skeptical of those. But anyway, I
Okay.
just wanted to get that out there.
Okay. How about the Heidelberg, offering him a chair at Heidelberg? Is
That
that
we have,
it?
yeah, no, that's true. That we have documented letters for that.
Okay. And but that also had the caveat, shut up about all the stuff that makes everybody uncomfortable.
Yeah, don't disturb the peace.
Right, right.
And he said, well, what
And
do you mean disturb the peace?
yeah. And one of the other interesting things about Spinoza is that while the public doesn't know him that well, almost every philosopher after Spinoza recognizes him as one of the real greatest of all times, from Hegel all the way down. We just did an episode talking about Henri Bergson, and Bergson tremendously influenced by Spinoza. It's actually a part of a chapter on Spinoza and Leibniz in his creative evolution, all the way down to Sigmund Freud, who really did take that idea that we have to look at ourselves before we can perceive truth. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I don't know much about Bergson, but it was once said that all of the history of philosophy is just a footnote to Plato. I think Spinoza plays a similarly important role in the evolution of modern philosophy, because first of all, some of the things he said, he was the first to say, and set the tone, or both set the standard for free thinking, and also set a lot of the questions and problems. Descartes, of course, plays an important role here too. I'm always fighting against two tendencies. First of all, there's a tendency to distinguish rationalism from empiricism. That's an old division. And this goes back to your earlier point about freedom. It's a way of breaking up the history of philosophy into Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz. They're the rationalists. Locke, Berkeley, and Hume, they're the empiricists. I think that's a false division. There's a great deal of experimentation in Descartes' philosophy of science. Spinoza, on the other hand, rejects the idea of innate ideas in a sense. So I don't think that that's a helpful distinction. However, when we do talk about such things like freedom and how a person can achieve a more superb condition by acting and thinking not according to how other things affect them, but by means of what they know to be true, what they truly know to be true. There's a kind of rationalism there, that the guide to better living is reason itself. The other campaign is against thinking that there is a father of modern philosophy, usually identified as Descartes. I think modern philosophy has a diverse parentage. because there are different streams of modernity in philosophy in the 17th century. So, there's not really, if I want to draw comparisons with art and literature, there's not really a Les Demoiselles d'Avignon that sets the standard for modern art, or Ulysses that sets the standard for modern literature. There's not a single work we can pick on that would say, okay, here's where modernity begins. Because you have Descartes, you have Hobbes, you have Gassendi, you have Spinoza, who I think really is the first most modern of all these philosophers, both because I believe he's an atheist. I don't think God as a divinity plays any role whatsoever in his philosophy, but also for his radical defense of toleration, secularity, and freedom.
So I wanted to kind of drill down into that a little bit. Spinoza's called an atheist. He's called a pantheist. He's at times called a nihilist. And I don't think that when a modern person hears those words, they understand what they mean, in the sense that they were applied to Descartes or to Spinoza. For example, when I looked at certain sections of Spinoza, it seemed very Buddhist to me, and I think that I interpret his atheism as meaning that there is no separate other thing that's God, that's supernatural, but not that there isn't something phenomenal going on here that we need to tune ourselves into, if that's fair to say. And I think when people hear pantheism, they think of a native with a bone in their nose that's got a hyper superstitified, if that's a word, picture of the world. But pantheism for Spinoza is quite a different thing, isn't it?
Well, let me push back a bit. We can eliminate nihilism off the bat. There's nothing nihilistic about Spinoza. He believes there is truth, and he believes that things truly are good and bad. So we'll put that aside. You're right that he's almost universally regarded as a pantheist. And if you open up any book about pantheism, or you look at any article, whether in the Encyclopedia of Philosophy or in a journal, Spinoza is always cited as the great pantheist. Here's why I reject that label. We could say that the pantheist, as you pointed out, the pantheist rejects the idea of there being some kind of transcendent supernatural deity. There's just nature. And that's clearly Spinoza's view. All there is nature. Whatever happens, happens in nature and through the processes and laws of nature. There's nothing beyond nature. So the pantheist and the atheist can agree on that. The atheist, too, would say all there is nature. There's nothing beyond nature. There's no supernatural. But if we want to maintain a distinction between pantheism and atheism, and I think we should, it comes down to this. Pantheism is still a kind of theism. And the pantheist, even if we reject that caricature of an ignorant, superstitious, very primitive individual, the pantheist still regards, what makes them a pantheist is that they regard nature as divine. That is, there's something about nature that makes it special, that makes it divine, and therefore worthy of reverence, adoration, worshipful awe, whatever might be the attitude. Because the pantheist regards nature as special in that sense. And I think that all of those attitudes, those psychological ways of addressing nature, are completely foreign to Spinoza's philosophy. For Spinoza, you should not look at nature in any mystical way, with any kind of worship or awe or adoration or reverence. The proper attitude to take towards nature is scientific understanding. And so I think it's wrong to think of him as a pantheist, because there's nothing truly divine about nature. There's no divinity at all.
And so he's also called a monist, which is a thing I think that people have trouble grasping what exactly that means. But that seems to be connected in with that, because the pantheistic idea, as you describe it, sounds like it's making divinity some other. And for him, there is no other, is there,
Well, there's no other in the grand sense.
in the biggest sense?
Yeah, in the most metaphysically grand sense. Everything that, I mean, this is something that Spinoza scholars debate. My take is that for Spinoza, nature really is constituted out of individuals. You're a real individual. I'm a real individual. Giraffes are real individuals, trees, and so on. The division of nature into individuals is not illusory. It's not a figment of our imagination. It's not just the way in which we perceive things. However, the monism comes in Spinoza's insistence that everything that is part of one thing, one system, nature with a capital N. That's the monism. There's not more than nature. There's just, if you look at it, if you step back and take the eternal perspective, there's just one reality.
And so sometimes we call that immanence.
Well, the immanence comes in the fact that what all these other things, you, me, the trees, giraffes, and so on, we are in that system. We are a part of it. And so when the system of nature brings about these individuals and causes them to come into being, causes them to go out of being, all the changes and developments within nature are brought about within nature. And so nature is what these philosophers would call an immanent cause. That is, nature is a causal power that brings about effects within itself.
Which is his idea of substance, right? Something that's literally lying underneath everything.
Yes.
Um, Go
I was
ahead, Will.
wondering if I could jump in on kind of this thread about how Spinoza perceived nature kind of as a substitute for how God was perceived prior, as kind of the source um, of everything. Let's say. So two questions come up for me, Stephen. One is, you mentioned earlier that Spinoza was accused of, um, how did you put it? God exists, but only philosophically, that
Right.
heresy. And I'm curious to hear what he meant by that. And then in your last book on Spinoza, I was reading about his kind of assertion that there's an individual nature that's emergent in each individual human being that is an expression of nature. And there seems to be some duality there between nature writ large and individual nature. I'd love to hear more about kind of both of those.
Sure. The accusation that Spinoza was insisting that God exists only philosophically, Spinoza himself never says that. One way of thinking about that accusation is to bring in Descartes, for whom his harsher theological critics felt that Descartes reduced God to just an eternal infinite cause and removed any kind of personality from God, and that Descartes' God is not a divinity that you would go to for comfort, or to whom you would pray, or from whom you would seek rewards and fear punishments, but just an eternal, infinite, substantial cause. That the charge that God exists only philosophically comes down basically to that. If Spinoza, when he uses the term God in the Ethics, is referring simply to the eternal, infinite, self-caused substance that is the foundation for everything else, it does seem very much like what people called a merely philosophical God, removing any anthropomorphic dimensions to God. That's a perfectly legitimate charge against Spinoza. He certainly does want to eliminate any way of thinking of God in anthropomorphic terms. Spinoza's God doesn't have any of the psychological characteristics traditionally attributed to the Abrahamic God. This God, Spinoza's God, doesn't have beliefs, expectations, doesn't make demands, doesn't issue commandments, has no hopes, doesn't reward and punish, and so on. Moreover, Spinoza's God doesn't have any of the moral characteristics traditionally given to the Abrahamic God. Spinoza's God is not good, just, or wise. God or nature just is. It's an infinite, eternal, powerful, causal source of everything that is.
And so, when I started getting into Spinoza more, of course, I read him in college, and we all do our best reading in college. I think I had a girlfriend. So, but what becomes evident is that it kind of doesn't just end there with Spinoza, because he does have this idea that we, through changing ourselves, can come into a much higher understanding of creation that's almost like a God's like view. And I'm thinking of his idea of subspecie eternitatis. And when I look at that, I start to wonder if this isn't really a closet Taoist or Buddhist. Is he? Do you think he's a mystic in any sense? Is his idea of intuition, does it go to things beyond geometrical truths, do you think?
So I'm often asked about Spinoza's relationship to Buddhism or similarities. I don't know enough about Buddhism or Taoism to speak intelligently about that. People find those resonances. Um, but let me go. This relates to the question about individual natures versus nature. Um, I don't think there's anything mysticist in Spinoza at all. I think he is as rationalist a philosopher as you can conceive of. And that's because this relationship, so yes, individuals in nature have their own natures. What makes you, you, what makes me, is you have a nature. That is, you are a striving, a, nature with a capital N, nature writ large, is power. Or if maybe we'd say energy. Each of us is a finite parcel of that infinite eternal power. And so your nature is to be that finite parcel of nature's power. And what you do as that finite parcel is you strive to maintain yourself as the finite parcel of power that you are. That this desk resists my pushing on it because it has its own conatus, or striving to maintain itself. You are striving to maintain yourself. That is what your individual nature is. But that individual nature is not something separate from nature. It is within nature and is a finite and determinate manifestation of that infinite eternal power of nature. So that's the connection between big nature and individual natures. And the best way to secure your persistence, the best way to not just maintain your power or striving, but to even increase it, is to avoid both pernicious, superstitious beliefs through the imagination, and to come to a rational understanding of just what your individual nature is and how that individual nature relates to the overall infinite, eternal nature to which we belong. But there's no mysticism here. There's no Kabbalah, for example. Spinoza is often spoken of as somebody who was deeply influenced by Kabbalah. Well, the only time in his writings that we know of where he mentions Kabbalah, he calls it foolishness.
So when he talks about excellent things being both rare and difficult, he's really talking about a kind of intelligence here, not anything transcendent.
Correct, absolutely. What he's talking about is achieving this superb condition of human nature where you are as free as a person can actually be. In fact, I would say there's a number of items here, or terms in Spinoza's philosophy, which all amount to the same thing. Freedom, virtue, rationality, happiness, blessedness, activity, all amount to different ways of describing this condition of what he calls the free person, somebody who does what they do because of what they know and not because how things happen to affect them.
And can we plug that into his argument about free will, which is a little complicated?
Actually, I don't think it's complicated at all. I
Oh,
think
is
it's
it?
perfectly simple. There is no free will.
And then how does that apply I mean, its relationship to freedom is where it gets complicated. If I
Okay, yes,
have freedom,
that
I
is
should be.
complicated, yes.
Yeah, yeah.
So, freedom doesn't mean free will. So by free will, what we mean is the capacity to choose independent of any absolutely determining factors. So I walk into the ice cream shop and I choose vanilla ice cream. According to a libertarian conception of free will, all things being the same, I could just as well have chosen chocolate. Right? Nothing determines my will one day. That's the classic libertarian conception of free will. And on that view, freedom is incompatible with causal determination. If the will is causally determined, it's not free. There's a whole other story, which philosophers call compatibilism. And this
Right.
story goes as follows, that our acts of will, our volitions and our choices are causally determined. Sometimes they're causally determined by factors outside of us. You know, other people's threats or physical force being imposed upon me. But sometimes my choices and volitions are determined not by external factors, but by internal factors. My beliefs, my desires, my character. So if I choose vanilla ice cream, not because somebody has a gun to my head, but because, first of all, I'm craving ice cream. Secondly, I believe that vanilla is the best flavor of ice cream. And I strongly desire at that moment vanilla ice cream. And all of this determines me to choose vanilla ice cream. And given all those factors, I will not, even cannot choose chocolate. Nonetheless, I'm free because my choice, my volition is an expression of me, of my beliefs and values. And I think Spinoza's conception of freedom is very similar. The more your volitions, the more your actions and choices are determined by your adequate knowledge of things, and especially your adequate understanding of the true values of things, the more free you are, the less subject you are to passions and to the effects that other things have on you. You're not at the mercy of the external world. You are in charge of yourself. You have a kind of autonomy.
So how would that sit with the idea of a predetermined mechanistic universe? And if that is the case, and he does believe those things, how does this guy write a book on ethics, which certainly kind of presupposes that we actually have a real choice in places as opposed to just reacting to conditions? And
That is one of the perennial questions that is always asked about Spinoza. First of all, I would avoid the word predetermined because that
okay,
suggests some kind of fate or divine providence who says, okay, this is how it's going to go. There's no such providence in Spinoza's system because there's not a God who has
to do it.
plans. There's no teleology.
Right.
But it's a perfectly legitimate question. You know, ethics on the face of it would seem to presuppose that we make a decision about how we want our lives to go and how we should act. And it's a free decision in the sense that you could choose not to do that. But I think Spinoza offers us a different way of looking at how a life evolves from one condition to another. And he offers that picture in a rare autobiographical set of paragraphs at the beginning of his very first extant treatise. So in around 1658, he started writing a book called A Treatise on the Emendation of the Intellect. And it's really a work in a sense of epistemology, but a very important moral dimension to it. And at the beginning of this work, he talks about how he was living the life of a merchant, and concerned with wealth and honor and all of those goods that come with being a successful businessman. And he describes how unsatisfying that life was. He didn't feel like he was pursuing true goods. And that dissatisfaction moved him to seek out truer goods, goods that would be more satisfying, goods that were less ephemeral. But notice that none of that required, that change in his life did not require any kind of libertarian freedom. It all happened because this kind of life gave rise to these kinds of feelings, and those feelings moved him to this quest for a better kind of life. And what Spinoza is doing in his book called Ethics is revealing to us truths about ourselves, which hopefully will move people to see what kind of life they are living and how they might achieve, what steps could be taken that would lead them toward a better life. In a way, very much, it's a very Socratic exercise. Socrates went around interviewing the citizens of Athens, both to find out what they valued and what kind of lives they were leading, and to try to persuade them that there was a better kind of life by putting in front of them the different values of their choices.
And that's part of that idea of whether we're seeing things subspecies durationis or subspecies aeternatus.
Yes.
Is that fair?
Yeah,
See, and
we want to
that
pull back.
vibrates with.
Sorry, we want
I
to
was going to
pull
say
back
that
to that more
vibrates
eternal.
with the first chapter of the Tao Te Ching, where he makes pretty much that distinction. And that's, of course, I always see what I want to see, of course,
Right.
like we all do. But
Well, I think
so
everybody.
I almost started to feel like these eternal truths were like the forms of Plato.
Yeah, but without all that metaphysical stuff going on. They are eternal truths. They are ideas that represent the essences of things. But what you really grasp is the way in which my nature, going back to what we were talking about earlier, what I really grasp is the way in which what I am truly is to be part of this bigger whole, to recognize that my freedom does not consist in this lack of determination, but that I am part of an overarching necessity. And when I recognize the necessity of all things, how all things are a part of nature, and here's a very stoic side of Spinoza, when I recognize the necessity of all things, my emotional life will be less full of turmoil. It won't be these radical ups and downs. I won't be so overwrought with joy at the acquisition of things and so overcome with sadness at their loss, because I will recognize that whether I gain or keep or lose these things is not thoroughly up to me. It's up to the causal order of nature. And so I achieve a greater immunity to the vicissitudes of nature and a greater way of dealing with the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. That's the moral side of
Which
it
now
all.
we kind of see as maybe an inevitable process of maturation,
Yeah,
sort of maturation of the intellect.
yeah. And going back to what you were saying earlier, it's difficult. I mean, when he says all things excellent as difficult as they are rare, it's a really hard process to achieve this condition, and not everybody gets it.
You know, it's interesting for me, that example, because I think when we elevate the rational, understanding that all the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune are just part of nature, and nature is unfolding as it does, and we're just part of that and experiencing it. Um, in order for a sling or an arrow not to hurt as much, um, we kind of have. I'm sure there are many models, but I'm going to offer two. One is, we examine or interrogate the emotional reaction that we're having, and so we have a relationship with our inner world in order to work through that. And maybe we're having a strong reaction to what's happening today because of something that happened in our childhood, etc. The other is, I think, to exert will to suppress the the emotional reaction that we're having today, and we use reason as the suppressing agent, where we tell ourselves with enough conviction that everything is unfolding as it should. So I think for me, in either case, there's some comments on the nature of reality and or free will inherent in those two models. I'm sure there are other models or ways of integrating those that I'm not thinking of.
I think it's a more natural process than a willful one. What's willful is your work to achieve this condition, but the condition itself is one where your reason and your affective your knowledge and your affects are in harmony. There are no states of mind for Spinoza that are not affective, that don't have an emotional component. What we are striving for is a joyful life where our power is increasing. And what I see through this condition, it's not so much that everything happens as it should, because there is no should here. Remember, again, there's no teleology, there's no predetermination. So it's not a kind of Leibnizian theodicy where this is the best of all possible worlds, and even if I'm suffering now, that's as it should be, and either I'll be recompensed down the road, or I should have faith that God chose this world. Remember, there are no other possible worlds for Spinoza. This is the only world. Nature is necessary. But I do achieve, through the acquisition of knowledge, a kind of control over my passions, but not a willful control, but I can eliminate some of the more harmful passions. And so the truly free person is not given to hate or envy or jealousy. At the same time, even the free person, as a human being, does have to live in nature. Spinoza explicitly says a human being can never not be a part of nature. So even the most free and rational person will experience passions, even if it's just a matter of stubbing their toe or getting a paper cut. But they will also experience sadness when a close friend or loved one dies. That's what it is to be human, and Spinoza recognizes that. The difference is that for Spinoza, the free person, while they will feel these passions and they will feel the appropriate sadness on the appropriate occasion, they will not let that sadness govern their activity, their lives. They will deal with it in the appropriate way. And I call this the Stoic Spinoza, but bringing up the term of arrows, there's a passage in Maimonides, who had a very strong influence on Spinoza. When Maimonides is discussing how divine providence works, it's very similar, that the person who has achieved this higher state of understanding enjoys a kind of protection, a protection from things that could happen to him through nature. And at one point, Maimonides uses the following metaphor. He says, the person enjoying providence can walk through a field of battle, and arrows are flying everywhere, but he will not be harmed. Now, one way of reading that is rather incredible, namely that this virtuous person from Maimonides will never get hit by an arrow, will never suffer any kind of pain. And I think that's wrong. And his commentary on Job reveals that that's not the way to read this, because Job suffers a lot of pain. What he really means is that we will first of all put those suffering passions into context, but we will also recognize that the ordinary pains, the slings and arrows that we do suffer as we go through life in this material world with our bodies, these are not true evils. As Socrates said, true evils are harms that affect the soul. And Maimonides says that that's the real lesson that Job learns. And I think it's not unlike what Spinoza has in mind, that if you want to speak of providence, and he does in the Theological Political Treatise, we can talk about providence. What he means is that virtue has its rewards, namely the blessedness and happiness that comes with the knowledge that virtue is.
Right, that there's not virtue for some other reason,
Right.
but the virtue is just like a ripe fruit falls from a tree as a result of seeing in and understanding.
Yeah. And he says, happiness is not the reward of virtue, it is virtue itself. To be in
Right,
this condition of virtue and freedom is to experience blessedness.
which is like a positive type of instant karma.
Sure. Yes.
Yes. Yeah. See, again, it sounds like Buddhism to me. The great way is not difficult for those who do not pick and choose. That we sort of step into a higher self, an eternal aspect of understanding, as a counterbalance, not an erasure of that self that suffers. Um, but
Right.
but
You certainly don't lose your sense of identity. Although now that you're using the phrase instant karma, it sounds more like John Lennon to me.
yeah, that was today's rock and roll reference.
Right.
So what do you think? What does Steven Nadler think about free will now that we've had the Copenhagen interpretation and the uncertainty principle and all that kind of stuff? Do you think it still holds? Or is there a
Um,
little crack there for free will? If we do all this hard work, will there maybe be some sort of maybe free will isn't the right way to say it, but I guess I'm trying to understand the nature of what we win when we go through this process.
so I don't think that anything that happens on the quantum level has anything to do with free will.
Okay.
And Robert Sapolsky, the biologist, published a book recently using all of this biological and other scientific material to argue that there is no such thing as free will. Uh, that's to say that it's not a philosophical question, but I think it is a philosophical question, partly because it all depends upon what you mean by free will. I don't think we'll ever know whether there's an absolute lack of determination. I'm not sure how you can establish that. And brain science has tried to establish gaps between certain brain states and other brain states, suggesting that gap allows for a lack of determination. You can find all sorts of experiments about people's decision making being preceded by certain chemical and neurological processes in the brain. None of that to me is to the point on the question of free will. I think free will is both a philosophical and a phenomenological question. For Spinoza, to believe in free will is a phenomenological phenomenon in the sense that it's based upon your ignorance of the causal determination. You think you're free because you feel yourself free. That's the phenomenological side of it. And you feel yourself free because you're not attending to the causes, you're unaware of the causes. I'm not a philosopher who has devoted a good deal of time to the question of free will, but my own instincts lean towards the compatibilist. And I think most professional philosophers today do as well. That once we get clearer on what the concept of free will is, we'll have a better understanding of when it is right to call ourselves free.
So, do you think it would be fair to say? I mean, I know that Schleiermacher was a great fan of Spinoza, and certainly Hegel, and a lot of these guys. Is it fair to say that the real task here is hermeneutical rather than epistemological?
For Spinoza,
Well,
no.
and the general philosophical question
Yeah.
that he's trying to address.
No, I think for Spinoza, if he's doing hermeneutics, it's in the theological political treatise where he's trying to teach us how to read the Bible. But no, I think Spinoza is out for the truth about things, the metaphysical truth about what's really real, and what are we, and what's the best kind of life for us, and what things are truly good for us and what things are truly bad. I don't think it's a linguistic question. I don't think it's a hermeneutical question.
I I should have qualified that. I mean more of an ontological hermeneutics, like a Gadamer sort of a sense, not so much in a tract, but where our life is the big text, and today is the next page that we're reading. And so that the whole job of philosophy is basically interpretive, is kind of what I'm pointing at.
I hesitate, but as you said before, everybody has their own way of seeing. I think Spinoza is like a Rorschach test.
Very much.
People see in Spinoza exactly what they want to see, and I think we should allow a great deal of latitude in how one reads Spinoza and what one takes away from it. And if seeing him as engaging in a kind of ontological hermeneutics helps you make sense of what Spinoza is doing, more conatus to you. I think.
And the reason I say that is because, like in some ways, like Spinoza, I have pursued very pragmatic, practical things. I saw some passage that said, "If learned men don't learn a trade, they surely will become scoundrels."
Uh-huh.
And within one of my trades was running water systems, and we used to do these water audits. And you'd have a bunch of fields, and you put a value in each field. But next to each field is a little pull down menu, and you get to pick from 0 to 9. And if you have the most sophisticated equipment that's measuring that piece of data, and you have the absolute top amount of confidence in it, you give it a 9. If you got that number by going, I don't know, it kind of looks like this, then you're down at the 1 or 0 level. And I feel like the formula, once you put the values in, that formula is like an eternal formula. It doesn't change from case to case. But that pull down stuff is all like the interpretive faculty before we accept something as at face value. So it seems like Spinoza is pointing out things like wealth or fame. They certainly seem to have an absolute value, but when we go into it kind of at a deeper interpretive level, we realize that there's some problems with it compared to relationship with eternal truths. And that's kind of what I mean by the hermeneutical part, I guess.
One thing I resist, though, there's a book that came out a couple of years ago by one of my fellow Spinoza scholars, where he wanted to say that um, for Spinoza, it all really comes down to conceptualizing. How do you read things? What perspective do you take on them? And so, for example, causal relations are really just conceptual relations. What I would want to resist is saying for Spinoza, the valuation of things is a matter of how you interpret them. Then that's why I was just calling it a hermeneutical project. Some things nothing is in and of itself good or bad. There are no absolute values in that sense. Whatever is just is, because whatever exists comes about with necessity through nature's laws. And there's no value one way or the other with respect to that. Nothing is good or bad in itself, intrinsically, without relation to something else. Good and bad are thoroughly relational terms, but at the same time, they are objective. Relativism is not subjectivism. It's not good because you think it's good. It's not bad because you think it's bad. However, something is good if it does, in fact, objectively, positively contribute to an increase in your well-being. And something is bad, relatively bad, but objectively bad, if it brings about a decrease or is an obstacle to your well-being. And so some things that are relatively objectively good for human beings may be relatively objectively bad for other individuals. So I know dogs, for example, can't eat chocolate. Just take a banal example. So chocolate is bad for dogs. It's not bad because we think it's bad for them. It's not bad because dogs think it's bad for them. It is objectively, but relatively bad for dogs. Whereas, an arsenic, there's nothing objectively good or bad about arsenic. It's just what it is. It's a chemical compound, but it is bad for us. Knowledge, on the other hand, is good for us, not because we think it's good. It's not subjective. It brings us to a better condition of well-being. So I would never want to say, and this is why, going back way to the beginning of our conversation, I would never want to say Spinoza's a nihilist, because he does believe that good and bad are objective but relativistic labels that we need to use to help us navigate our way through nature.
And it seems like Spinoza doesn't just believe this. He seems to actually be a product of having lived this, and that these realizations that he puts across came out of a real life experience as opposed to inferential conclusions. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, and I think that that early experience he had as a businessman, realizing that it wasn't the life for him. Yes, absolutely right.
And that he wasn't hypnotized by fine clothes or wealth, or which we kind of come to expect from philosophers, don't we?
Yeah, I get the sense that Spinoza lived his philosophy. That maybe, I don't know whether he did or did not think of himself as an example of the free person having achieved that state, but I think it was certainly something he aspired to. We know that he led a rather sober life. He wasn't given to austerity. The notion that Spinoza thinks that we should eliminate the passions from our lives and live an austere, deprived state, on survival mode. That's just not right. In the Ethics, he says that the free person will enjoy beautiful things, enjoy good food, good art, theater, and social company. So it's not as if the ideal condition is one of being a hermit.
As an ascetic, right?
It's an ascetic. Rather, it's one where they partake of good things in moderation. And Spinoza, he was not an isolated individual. He had a circle of friends, and he enjoyed good company. At the same time, I think he led. He wasn't pursuing riches inordinately. What we know about his diet was that it was a sensible diet. He probably wore sensible shoes. I think he strove to live the free and virtuous life that he recommends others.
And so when he gives us advice about how to go about this, which I think is one of the things that makes him maybe the most valuable of a lot of philosophers, is that we don't just walk off thinking cool new things, but there's actually a reflexive component. It's like, for us to understand reality at this higher level, we have to go through some stuff.
Yeah.
self-exploration, turning the light on our own processes. We could almost feel Freud coming in the future out of this a little bit.
And it's also not just advice he's giving us; he's demonstrating these truths. And, the ethics has the geometric format. He never really says you should do this or maybe you're better off doing that. Rather, it's a series of propositions with demonstrations that are supposed to convince you, not through rhetoric, but through mathematical certainty, that this life is the life of freedom and virtue.
And this is where I want to plug your books,
Hey, go ahead.
shamelessly, because one could easily say, well, if there's one philosopher to read, it's Spinoza. And I understand that argument, and yet at the same time, if that's the only book of philosophy you ever read, you're probably not going to get real far with Spinoza, would you? Because Spinoza's not really easy. And unless one has gone through certain processes to kind of learn about philosophy, there's a great utility to having someone bridge that for you. And I think that's what your books really do. Is that a good way to
I hope
fair?
so. Yeah, I hope so. I would never recommend somebody start their philosophical reading with Spinoza. And I
Exactly.
would never start an introductory course with Spinoza. In fact, I wouldn't use Spinoza in an introduction to philosophy class. It's just too hard. Plus also, speaking from experience, once you get hooked on Spinoza, that's it. You're done for. He will you will be obsessed with him for the rest of your life. And I still like to go back and write and study other philosophers, Cartesians, medieval Jewish philosophers. I love teaching Plato and Socrates. But yeah, Spinoza is not the place to begin. But if you haven't read Spinoza, I think you're really missing something important. And this is shown by the fact that people who do read Spinoza, and not just professional philosophers, not just students, but ordinary people who are interested and curious about Spinoza, they love Spinoza. I mean, you walk down the street today and you won't find many Cartesians or Leibnizians, but
Right.
you will run into people who think Spinoza got it right. And Spinoza has infiltrated high and popular culture in a way in which maybe no other philosopher has, possibly excepting Socrates or Nietzsche. But you have novels, operas, works of visual art, plays about Spinoza. You have musical compositions inspired by Spinoza. The American grocery chain Trader Joe's had Spinoza bagels. So Spinoza really has become, in a way, has achieved a kind of cultural popularity that's rare for a philosopher.
As well, he should. I would totally sport a Spinoza T-shirt if I had one.
Oh, you just go online. There are a dime a dozen.
I bet there are. It said participate in the eternal totality on the
Yeah.
front.
Yeah.
So, Stephen, you mentioned medieval Jewish philosophy, and I wanted to spend a little time on that. Maybe this ties back to Spinoza. We don't have to leave Spinoza, but just the phrase Jewish philosophy is interesting to me, and I'd love to hear from you about how Jewish philosophy and Jewish religion might relate to one another, maybe both in medieval times, and is that distinction also true today?
Yeah, I mean, there's a great deal of discussion about what is Jewish philosophy and what is Jewish philosophy. So what is Jewish philosophy? And how would it differ from, let's say, a Jewish religious text? I think it's a matter, and especially within Judaism, I think this becomes a particularly complicated question, given the general, I won't say lack of dogmatism, but the importance of debate and disagreement in Jewish intellectual traditions. It's a very fine line between theology and philosophy. But generally speaking, there are certain questions that we recognize as philosophical questions. And there are other questions that we recognize as theological or halakhic, Jewish legal questions. So if a text is a midrash on halakha, on Jewish law, it's unlikely that you're going to find a lot of philosophical discussions, but it's possible. If you read through rabbinical writings, you find great exercises of philosophical reasoning, uses of modus ponens, modus tollens, reductio ad absurdum, and so on. So philosophical methods often inform Jewish theological discussions. But there are also certain questions that really are philosophical questions, questions of metaphysics, the nature of creation, the nature of God can be a philosophical question. Moral questions, even within the Jewish theological milieu, are philosophical questions, which bleed into theological or religious ones. Epistemological issues, likewise, not what should I know or what does God command me to know, but what is knowledge? And to the extent that a thinker is addressing these philosophical questions, both in a Jewish textual milieu and accessing a certain Jewish intellectual and textual tradition, that to me is what makes for Jewish philosophy. Now let's take Spinoza as an example. A lot of what Spinoza is talking about in the Ethics is identical to what Descartes was talking about in his Meditations or his Principles of Philosophy, and what Leibniz was talking about in his writings. The reason why I would insist that Spinoza belongs to the history of Jewish philosophy, as well as to the history of Cartesian philosophy and the history of Stoic philosophy, is because when Spinoza answers certain metaphysical or moral questions, he's accessing a certain textual intellectual tradition that these other philosophers, Descartes and Leibniz, are not. Because Spinoza has access to, and really employs his access to Maimonides' Guide of the Perplexed, the Mor Nevuchim, or Gersonides' Milchamot Hashem, Wars of the Lord. For example, Spinoza's account of happiness and the relationship between virtue and happiness, I think, is a culmination of a certain rationalist tradition in medieval Jewish philosophical thinking. In a way, taking it to its logical conclusion. I think a case could be made that Spinoza's God is also not really Maimonides' God, but again, the logical conclusion of Maimonides' God, or Maimonides' views on immortality. And so what makes a philosophy a Jewish philosophy is that it is in dialogue with a certain historical and textual tradition. You don't have to be Jewish. There was a great advertising campaign in New York in the 1960s for Levy's rye bread. You don't have to be Jewish to enjoy Levy's rye bread, and had a great visual campaign. I would say you don't have to be Jewish to do Jewish philosophy. Is Jean-Paul Sartre doing Jewish philosophy when he writes Anti-Semite and Jew, and is discussing the philosophical question of what it is to be Jewish and what's the relationship between the Jew and the anti-Semite? On the other hand, simply by virtue of being Jewish does not make you doing Jewish philosophy. What matters is who you're in conversation with, what's the dialogue you're engaged in, and what texts are you addressing, and what questions are you answering.
So it's not even that there are particular methods, philosophical methods, or or particular philosophical ideas that are part of or uniquely part of the Jewish tradition. Rather, it's bouncing the ideas and the methods off that lineage to inform them that makes them that
Yeah.
makes something Jewish philosophy. Okay.
In a way, it's taking philosophical methods and philosophical questions and applying them to Judaism. So, for example, here's a philosophical question, which I think is a philosophical question, but I think it's a specifically Jewish philosophical question. Namely, what is the status of halakha, of the Jewish law? Where does it get its normative force from? Should we carry out the mitzvot, the commandments, because God commands them? Or did God command them because they're good? You know, the old Euthyphro question, but now applied to a specific Jewish context. So Maimonides, for example, there are long discussions in the Guide of the Perplexed about the normativity of Jewish law, and he tries to rationalize the Jewish commandments. That's a philosophical exercise, an exercise about the normativity of law, but applied to a specific Jewish to a specific Jewish religious context.
Got it. And when you mentioned Sartre, I remembered in our pre-meeting, the topic came up of anti-Semitism, and you differentiated anti-Semitism from anti-Zionism from anti-Judaism, if I remember correctly.
Yes.
And I was really curious to hear more about that. Is now an okay time to get into that a little?
Sure, why not?
Right.
Especially because Spinoza has been accused of being an anti-Semite. Anti-Semitism, and I'm just going to use the definition formed by the special envoy for anti-Semitism, appointed by the U.S. government. Anti-Semitism is the hatred of Jews, hatred directed at Jews. I would add hatred directed at Jews because they're Jews. For example, a person might hate Jews, but not know that they're Jews. Or he might hate these Jews not because they're Jewish, but because they're wearing the wrong kind of sneakers. Anti-Semitism has to be hatred directed at Jews because of what they are, because they are Jews. Anti-Judaism would be maybe not hatred, but a strongly critical or perhaps hatred of Judaism as a religion. I would not say, and I would in fact strongly argue against the idea that Spinoza is anti-Semitic. Mainly, first of all, because I don't think Spinoza was given to hatred in the first place. Secondly, I don't think he hated Jews. What he was opposed to were the major organized sectarian religions. And so I think we could say he was strongly critical of Judaism. But he was no less strongly critical of Catholicism, although he had to be a little bit more careful in criticizing Christianity because he was living in a Christian nation. So he could direct his ire against organized sectarian religions, against Judaism, without the risk that he would incur were he to engage in a full-on critique of Christianity. But the problem with these organized religions is, for him, moral and political. It's not a hatred. He thinks that sectarian religions introduce divisions into society. They set citizens against citizens, and also raises questions about their loyalty to their own nation state. So, for example, the Dutch Calvinists were strongly opposed, many Dutch Calvinists were strongly opposed to allowing Catholics to practice openly, because one could legitimately ask, are they more loyal to the Dutch Republic or to the Pope in Rome? And Spinoza sees that these organized sectarian religions are a threat to the unity, stability, and security of society. So his anti-Judaism, I'm sure, his own personal experience within Judaism had something to do with it. But I wouldn't call it a hatred. I would call it a reasoned philosophical and political and moral and religious critique of Judaism as an organized religion with laws and superstitious ceremonies, equally applicable to other religious traditions. Anti-Zionism, I think the bar for anti-Semitism has been lowered so much that if you are a critic of Israeli policies, either internal to the state of Israel or regarding Israeli treatment of the Palestinian people in the West Bank and Gaza, to be critical of that now gets you labeled as an anti-Semite. we need to remember that there are ultra-Orthodox Jewish sects that are anti-Zionist. For example, the Satmars are against the existence of the political state of Israel because they believe that only the Moshiach, the Messiah, is authorized to reestablish a Jewish state. I think the Jewish Voices for Peace, as much as I am turned off by their tactics and by a lot of their rhetoric, are we going to call these Jews anti-Semitic because they stand against the state of Israel? So I think we have to be really careful about conflating criticism of Israel, even suggesting that the homeland for the Jews should be a binational state, not a single Jewish state. We should be very careful about calling these views anti-Semitism.
I think there's a connection that's worth mentioning there, though, that um, uh, Israel's policies, internal and external, and the existence of a Jewish state, in general, might be criticized by these groups or in general to a standard that other groups are not criticized. And so I think it's not only whether Israel is being criticized politically or not that is the standard, it's whether it's held to a different standard than other political entities.
I totally agree. And I would also say that a lot of the anti-Zionism is rooted in anti-Semitism. I just think they have to be distinguished. If you're an anti-Zionist because you are in general against any nation state founded on strict ethnic or religious principles, and you carry that across the board, then you're consistent. No, I totally agree with you. And to single Israel out does at least reek of anti-Semitism, and probably is, in many cases, deeply grounded in anti-Semitism.
Even if the protest is voiced by a group like Jewish Voices for Peace.
Yes, although I still have trouble with, the notion of a self-hating Jew. I've always found that a really empty label. Noam Chomsky, sort of the paradigm of the people, think of him as the paradigmatic self-hating Jew. I don't find that a useful label in any circumstances.
That's interesting. I do relate to it. And I think that there's a way that I'm not even sure how to put this, because my experience of it comes from kind of not a strictly verbal place, and I don't know if I've done a good job putting words to this before, but um, that there's a little voice in my head that pops up sometimes, and I suspect it does for other Jews as well, maybe not all, but I think some admit it's there and some don't, that says, what if Hitler or fill in the blank was right, and that we're inferior? And I think that that's the outcome, and this is maybe going to reveal maybe some of my philosophy, half baked as it is. That's the result of a drumbeat of thousands of years of persecution, that we carry around with us, kind of a fear that it could happen again, and maybe even it'll work. And what is the mark of superiority if not the ability to eradicate?
So I agree with some of what you say. I think we all, as Jews, have that voice saying, "What if it happens again?" Look at Charlottesville a couple of years ago. Look at the exclusionary policies of the Trump administration. I think it would be naive for us to think it could never happen again. However, my takeaway from that is not that the ability to oppress and murder is a sign of superiority, and that therefore there must be something. My voice doesn't say maybe they're right, maybe there's something inferior about Jews. My voice takes something different away, namely, yes, what if it can happen again? There's a fear there, but my voice also says that we're living in a different world than the 1930s because it did happen. And do we need Israel? Just in case. I don't think it's an unreasonable thing to believe. Yes, we do need Israel just in case. I don't happen to believe that, but I grew up in New York, and I don't think New York Jews grow up with the idea that we are inferior and that we need Israel just in case. But that's very particular to my case. But what I do find, here's the other voice in me, and this is partly because of how I was raised and having gone to Hebrew school, and having children myself now, and soon to have grandchildren are on the way. What I find in the back of my mind, speaking, there's the rational side of me that thinks, well, do we really need Israel? Or do we really need a state exclusively for the Jews? A nation state that defines itself as exclusively for the Jewish people? Or would we be better off as Jews with a homeland that is itself a binational state? That's a debate I have. But the other voice in the back of my mind is, and I think so many Jews have this, and either they admit it or they ignore it, is a deep emotional attachment to Israel, especially if you've been there and if you have relatives there. It may be a perfectly irrational attachment. It's very emotional, I think.
All attachment is irrational, isn't it? Passionate?
Yeah, okay, I'll go with that.
I was born in Israel, and lost my parents in a terrorist attack. So,
Okay.
so I'll completely acknowledge that that I have an attachment, and um, and I guess from a Darwinian sense, the ability to eradicate another people is a kind of tacit superiority. I'm not saying it's a moral superiority or a
Okay,
philosophical one.
it's a
Um,
stronger conatus.
yeah, yeah, right. Um, so I'm curious. You mentioned that New York Jews don't necessarily think of themselves as persecuted, but I don't know if that's true on the campus of Columbia University these days. And I think anti-Semitic attacks are up. I think I saw some 300+% since October 7th. Um, and you said we live in a different world than the 1930s. Are you sure? Help me believe that, because I want to.
Yeah. No, I'm not sure. I guess it's a hope that in light of what happened in the 20th century, we have more political, moral safeguards against that kind of thing happen. But I think my confidence in that is probably weakening over the last couple of years. Let's say the last 9 years. So no, I'm not confident. And I do, as a Columbia PhD, I'm troubled by what's happening on that campus. But I'm also troubled by the way in which anti-Semitism is being so cynically manipulated by political powers. And I'm not on the Columbia campus now, so I can't speak with any authority about how Jews on that campus feel. But I do believe that they are justified in having, seeing what's happening, just videos from seeing what's happening on campus and in the Morningside Heights neighborhood. I think it's a very frightening situation. So I would temper what I said about New York Jews in that. I guess what I meant was growing up as a Jew in New York when I did, and and living there in the 1980s. It may be that the last 9 years refute my confidence.
I think of it more as the last two, but yeah, I'm not sure that
Well, by
matters a
9
whole
years,
lot.
I meant going back to the beginning of the first Trump administration.
Huh. Okay. I mean,
See, I grew up in New York during those very same years, and I'm an orphan, so I was told I could be part Jewish, but I have no way to know. And I guess I was around a lot of Jewish people, but I never got a general message that they were somehow inferior. In fact, if anything, if I was to try to uh, to understand some of the reactions, I might make the argument that there is a certain superiority that I mean, I think anybody who is intelligent knows that there will be people that will hate you just for your intelligence.
Yeah.
And if you're successful, there will be people that just hate you for your success. But and I haven't been back for years, so I can't speak to the change in that.
Well, the New York I grew up in was so I was born in the city. I grew up on Long Island, and then I went to graduate school in the city. And the New York, in my experience in those days, it was a very Jewish city. The holidays came around, and you saw menorahs, you saw mezuzot on doorways, you saw Jews walking around everywhere. When I moved to Wisconsin, all of a sudden, the holiday season, there are these green and red lights. I thought, oh, what's with this? And Madison is kind of special for the Upper Midwest, but even here, um, the schools didn't close for the Jewish holidays the way they did on Long Island. But Boaz, let me ask you, so as a born Israeli, what's your take on whither Israel? Do we still need a exclusively a nation state exclusively for Jews?
well, I think the word exclusively there is doing a lot of work. I'm not
Well,
an
that's how it
expert
was
on
enshrined recently, right?
the what?
That's how it was enshrined recently by Knesset.
Yeah. I'm not an expert on Israel, so this is just me here. I think that given the extent of persecution that Jews have experienced, um, Jews need a, a place to call home that they can feel safe in. I think the way Israel works today, Arabs are citizens in Israel, and it might already not be exclusive in the way that exclusivity might be envisioned, and I think that's a good thing. I think. Um,
They are second-class citizens, though, aren't they?
I mean, they serve on the Supreme Court. They vote. I'm again, I'm not an expert on Israel,
Yeah.
but I think there are some tropes there that get mixed in on both sides, and I might be victim to some of them. But my, having spent time in Israel, I went to school there in elementary school for a little while, and there were Arab kids in my class, and there wasn't. Um, I didn't experience it as second class citizens. There absolutely are dynamics where Arabs living in the West Bank or Gaza who are traveling into Israel to work and things like that are going through checkpoints. They're being checked for whether they're carrying explosives, whether they have a right to work, and certainly there's security everywhere, and stop and frisk kinds of policies are include racial profiling. There's no question, and there could be argument that that's justified because Jews aren't typically the ones carrying out suicide bombings in Jerusalem. Um, so, but I think that anti-Semitism has a way of coming back again and again, um, in sometimes in seemingly new ways or in subtle ways before it explodes. And I don't think we're out of the woods. And I had an interesting experience when October 7th happened. I had the sense that I should have been there, with my people. That if we don't look out for each other for real, then those kinds of things will continue to happen and could be worse. And and I don't know what that looks like. But I don't think that um, anti-Semitism is no longer a very visceral threat.
No, I would agree with that. In fact, I would say it's not even very subtle. You know, just putting aside things like Charlottesville, I was watching. I have friends still around the Columbia campus and was watching videos. And when Jewish students are told no Zionists will be allowed here, there's nothing
Or
subtle
the
about that.
American Psychologists Association not referring patients to Zionist practitioners,
Yeah,
therapists.
yeah, I totally agree. So to bring it back briefly to Spinoza, one of the things
Yeah.
that always bothers me is when we're talking about Spinoza as a Rorschach test. Um, Sometimes he's referred to as a proto-Zionist because there's a statement in the Theological Political Treatise where he says, and maybe if they can get over their emasculation from their religion, God will restore them again in a homeland, or God will give them a nation again. And this is taken to be a kind of wishful thinking on Spinoza's part. I think what he's really doing is making fun of Zionism there. Well, Zionism of all lettres. There is no Zionism yet in the 17th century, but yeah, it's there's nothing Zionist in Spinoza's philosophy.
Yeah.
I do have to be somewhere shortly after noon. Can we wrap this up soon, you think?
You bet. Brian, any last questions, comments?
No, I guess I just would encourage people once again to check out Stephen's books because there's some real gems within the work of Spinoza, but they're kind of they're buried in some thick stuff, and this is definitely a way to bridge across that to be able to get those out of there. Um, I think uh, I personally think that we're in a time where philosophy makes more difference maybe than it ever has, and that we need to be smarter and we need to be thinking clearer and we need to be communicating better. And everything about Spinoza, I think, is all about that. And so I see it as a real remedy in parts to the chapter that we're in. Do you have any thoughts about that, Stephen?
I totally agree, and I appreciate the endorsement of my books, which are for sale at fine stores everywhere.
We'll
Um,
put it in the notes.
okay, no, I think you're absolutely right. We've kind of come full circle now in our conversation to what you know we need more philosophy in the world today. And one of my great disappointments after 9/11 is how the media went to politicians and journalists and even poets for their thoughts. But you didn't see philosophers coming out. They weren't at the forefront. But I think that's exactly, we need a greater public role for philosophers. And I'm not saying that it's the media to be blamed, because I think philosophers themselves have become so over-specialized and have isolated themselves from the general public. Maybe less so than other humanities disciplines, because I like to think that philosophers haven't fallen for a lot of the jargony kind of scholarship that passes for a lot of humanities work. There's still a kind of clarity and appreciation for truth among philosophers, and I think they should take advantage of that.
And a carefulness about language,
Yes.
and a realization of the pernicious influence of rhetoricians,
Yep.
which is
Yes.
really rampant today, I think.
Yeah.
Stephen, thank you so much. I really enjoyed the conversation with you today, and your time was really valuable to us.
Well, thank you.
Absolutely
It's
wonderful.
been a pleasure, and I appreciate the opportunity. And Boaz, someday I'd like to continue the conversation about your experience growing up in Israel.
I would too, and maybe even on the podcast. I feel like there's more there, and we have some other guests potentially coming up that will also inform that. So,
Great.
yeah, we'll definitely come back to it. Thank you.
Thank you.